interpretation right now for if they need interpretation for Cantonese or for Somali, if there's anyone who's not able to access. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. And this is being recorded, so if you don't want to be on camera, that's completely okay. So I want to welcome everybody. I am Samantha Fogg. I am your Seattle Council PTSA co-vice president of advocacy. If you're looking on your screen right now, some people see me as white, others do not. I am in fact both Chinese and white. I am also disabled, but you can't see that through the screen. I have dark hair. I'm wearing a headset and I'm sitting in a armchair near a very chaotic bookshelf. And what I just did is a visual description. And the reason we do that is because not everybody can see the screen. You might be on your phone, you might not be able to see screens. All of those different reasons, but we try and make sure that everybody has access to the same amount of information, whether you can see what's on the screen or not. And so that's why I did that. If anyone has any accessibility needs or accommodations that they need, please feel free at any point to unmute and make a request, to put a request in the chat. Or if you would rather do it more privately, you can text me, and I just put my phone number in the chat. It's 678-906-9523. So if you need an accommodation, feel free to reach out that way. I would like to take a moment now to acknowledge that while we're in a virtual space, we're all on land that is unceded land that we have a complicated relationship with, and that while we're here and together and we're working for the benefit of all of every child, and we're working together, and we're going to try and honor the people who both came before us, but also the people who are still here, and just to make sure that we are honoring the space and each other. I also want to acknowledge that some of you are coming here from the state of the district address, and so this is maybe your second meeting of the evening, and so I want to thank you for that. We're going to be having a friendly and productive and informative meeting tonight. We've got a lot of stuff to learn, and I'm sure that we've got folks with questions. We'll be starting out. This is going to start out with me asking a lot of questions of Assistant Superintendent Berge, and then we'll go into having space for questions from you as well. And with that, I would like to introduce Assistant Superintendent of Business and Finance, JoLynn Berge. And I want to say how thrilled I am that she can be here with us tonight. I know that she was also at the State of the District address, so we're extending her workday even further. And I also, for those who don't know, in addition to having been with Seattle Public Schools since I think 2016, prior to that, Assistant Superintendent JoLynn Berge was with OSPI, the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And so she really has both a deep knowledge of our district, but also how things work in our state as a whole, and can bring that to us so that we can figure out and understand how we're situated in our buildings, in our district, in our state. And so with that, I'd like to just say welcome, JoLynn, and give you a moment if you want to say anything.
Thank you for that very gracious introduction, Sam. I'm JoLynn Berge. I'm sitting in my office. I have brown hair, I wear glasses. I'm wearing a black jacket, sitting in an office with better lighting than usual because I got a new computer. So it apparently makes all the difference between me looking like I'm in a dark hole versus the same office with the same lighting as before. So happy to be here tonight. Just want to say how much I value this partnership. So thank you.
And I just noticed, and I don't know if she was going to sneak in or not, but if she was, sorry, that we have been joined by Seattle Public Schools Board Director, Liza Rankin. And so I just wanted to say hello. And Liza, if you would like to say hello, you are welcome.
I was going to sneak in. I'm just leaving central offices where Superintendent Jones and others presented the state of the district. So I'm going to drive home and listen in with my camera off.
Thanks, Liza. Sorry for thwarting your sneaking, but we appreciate you being here. All right, so I am going to jump in. First, I want to thank everyone here tonight who advocated for enrollment stabilization, for changes to the prototypical formula, for per pupil transportation, for increasing language access in public schools, for killing the anti-critical race theory bills, and for so much more. This short session was intense. There was drama, there were deadlines, there were calls to action, and if somebody is not muted, so
Sam, you're on mute.
all right, let's try that again. So even though legislative session ended a few days ago, I'm still processing it all. And so let's take a look back over what happened just a little bit, and what happened in the budget. I know that we had three main things we were hoping for out of the 2022 legislative session in terms of budget. Those were enrollment stabilization, increases to the prototypical formula for physical, social, and emotional support in schools, and improvement to pupil transportation funding. We put up testifiers on these bills when they were in public hearings. We had folks signing in, we had folks submitting written testimony. When all is said and done, how did things end up for our district?
Really, really well. This session we had not very high expectations, and we came out and I thought we killed it. I really did. Just a fabulous partnership with you, Sam, doing a magnificent job, and Director Rankin doing a fabulous job. And just we had a lot of coordination across K-12 on a lot of issues. And that's just so powerful when K-12 can come together, right? That's when we really can get things done. And we saw that happen for our district. So we did get some money for enrollment stabilization, and we'll talk more about that. We've got additional funding for our prototypical model. We'll talk more about that in a moment. They passed a cost of living adjustment at 5.5%, which is the largest I have ever seen the legislature fund. And we did pass a transportation bill that is it looks like it's going to produce additional revenue for our district in the 23-24 school year. So just a really great job. And like you spoke about, the things that didn't pass are equally important. So there were quite a few bills that could have been very detrimental to K-12, and those did not pass at the end of the day. And some of those were hard fought battles. A lot of it may have been behind the scenes on a few bills that maybe PTSA probably wasn't front and center on, but there were some bills by the trial lawyers, and just things that would have caused the district a lot of money if they had passed. So just a really great session.
So now we know that we've gotten through legislative session, and we know that our levies passed, and that means that we maintain, and we know that we got some enrollment stabilization, not full stabilization. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you about how our district determines where the money goes. But before I do that, I have received a lot of questions around a rumor that is going around, and I've been asked this by a lot of parents. So this rumor is, when there are budget cuts, the first thing they cut is special education. And I need to ask you, is this true?
I'm happy to report that's not true. So I'll tell you what we're all feeling. We're feeling they're not budget cuts in the building. Staffing allocations have not been reduced, but what you are feeling is an adjustment to bring staffing in alignment with our new lower enrollment. So that's what the Enrollment Stabilization Bill was all about. We staffed at like 275 FTE above what we had students for this year. And so you're feeling that adjustment, and that's both in general education setting and in special education. So there were not budget cuts out to schools. Budget cuts means we lowered allocations, we lowered across the board some type of staffing. What we're feeling is an alignment of staffing to a much lower enrollment.
Thank you for clearing that up.
And so let me just say this too. Special education is not the first thing that's cut at all. And and actually, I've not seen special education cut in this district. It's rare for that to happen. So some of the things that go into that, there's a federal requirement for maintenance of effort, meaning dollar for dollar, we have to spend the same amount that we spent in state and local dollars on special education as we did the year before, right? So that's the first protection on special education. There's a per pupil calculation within that and a total calculation. We have our students' IEPs. That means we have to deliver the services that are in the IEPs. We have our collective bargaining agreement that we need to honor that talks about staffing levels. So those are all things that really protect special education from being cut.
Thank you. And I think that it was a really important thing for our families to hear because, like I said, I've heard this rumor and it was just really good to hear you clear it up. So we've had a lot of talk about the state's prototypical formula. And I've also heard some confusion thinking, honestly, from legislators as well as from parents, thinking that the formula the state uses to allocate funds is how these funds are then distributed to individual school buildings. But this is not actually the case. This is just how funds are pushed out to districts. Can you talk a bit about how funding is allocated to buildings?
Sure. So in our district, we use something called the weighted staffing standards. And that's how we take the prototypical model and we combine what the state provides, what schools need, and what our collective bargaining agreement says. And we roll that together, and that's how schools are evenly, fairly allocated based on numbers, their staffing. And so one of the things that doesn't align is that we have a lot more principals and assistant principals than we're funded for. We have a lot more custodians than we're funded for still. We still have more nurses than we're funded for. So we have to make decisions. I can't think, the only place that we really don't have staffing in the WSS is we don't staff family involvement coordinators, parent involvement coordinators. Those are funded a little teeny weeny bit in the prototypical model, and we don't have those units that are in the WSS. Those units, those types of jobs are typically staffed by grants and things like that. So every district has to decide to make a choice about how they bring in that allocation from the state, and then how do they put that out in schools that reflects their values, what schools need, and what they've agreed to with their labor unions.
I'm seeing a question in the chat that says, are there any types of staff in schools that are not tied to enrollment? And I see a comment saying principals. So
yeah,
is there anything else?
Every school has to have a principal. That is true. But assistant principals are tied to enrollment. So Vivian, that's kind of, yes, principal, everyone does get one, but APs is driven by enrollment. So that is true. I was trying to think. Yep. Librarians, pretty much everyone gets a 0.5 at least, right? So there's some that there's a foundational support where there's one person in the front office, at least one principal, half-time librarian. So there's some basic things that you get really regardless of size. And then after that really depends on size.
And I know we've mentioned this, I know you mentioned this earlier, but I just want to emphasize and make sure we're firmly grounded in what things look like district-wide. For the 21-22 school year, which is the year we're in right now, enrollment, we had some stabilization, right? So is that accurate?
We did. We are going to receive about $30 million in enrollment stabilization between our general fund enrollment and the impact of using a higher enrollment number on our levy calculations, because our levy calculations are enrollment based as well. So it's about 30 million in total. But let me say this, we pre-spent that by having such higher staffing this year. And so if we hadn't received the enrollment stabilization, the plan was to spend down our economic stabilization dollars. So what the enrollment stabilization and receiving that from the state means is that we don't have to spend down our reserve. And we do have a board policy, and there is the state auditor's office and OSPI who measures our financial health. There's a financial health indicator, and your reserve is a part of that calculation. So it's important for districts to have a reserve. Ours is 3 to 5% of our last year's expenditures, around $39 million out of $1 billion. And that's what we hold in reserve. And that meets their criteria. It's not as big as maybe some other places have, but it's not as low as others either. But getting the enrollment stabilization really helps us not have to deal with financial pressure in the upcoming year as we look towards 23-24.
And so this year, even though I know a lot of our families are feeling like there weren't lots and lots of extra people, we still actually had more staff than our enrollment would have.
Oh, yeah, we did. And I know we're getting a lot of AP questions. APs are critical to school operations, but some schools do not have APs. And let me just say this, is that our district, having an AP when you have less than 300 kids is not ever financially going to work out. And workload wise, that's not something districts give that I've seen. We did some work looking at state data to make sure that we were not behind other districts in AP allocations. And the data proved out that we actually have more principals and assistant principals per pupil than anyone else our size, and way above the state average. So we have more. I think what the note in the chat from Vivian is there criteria for school size viability? That is the question at hand. There is a healthy enrollment size, a right size enrollment for schools that generates an AP, that generates a full-time counselor, social worker, that generates that full-time librarian and nurse. So those are the things that we're not feeling in our system, because right now we have lots of small schools. And so then we're spreading those resources super thin, and everyone is in a resource constrained type of environment.
I see that Director Rankin has her hand up. So I am going to go ahead and let her say what she needs to say. So Director Rankin.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I guess, pop in and add some context on the what JoLynn was talking about with the enrollment stabilization and the numbers, and having 275, technically overstaffed. And so the board and staff have multiple times a year, every month, sometimes, budget work sessions where we talk about what's happening in the current budget, if things need to shift, and what we're planning for the next budget. And 2 years ago, as part of those discussions, we as a board directed with Chief Berge and others, we made the decision to normally staffing would adjust to actual enrollment every year. You may remember, you may have been at a school where there's October shifts, or your school building gets the fall projections in about this time of year and starts talking about maybe losing staff. So for the last 2 years, we asked the district to prioritize maintaining staffing even as our enrollment was going down over the course of the pandemic. And that's just not, it's not sustainable, it's not affordable to keep doing that. And so that's sort of what JoLynn was talking about with, yes, we're getting enrollment stabilization, but it's at 50% of the actual change between 2019 enrollment, where we're currently staffed, and the actual projected enrollment for this fall. And so I just wanted to sort of add that for, when you lose a teacher or a program changes, it feels like a cut because it's a loss. I just wanted to sort of add that context for what she was talking about. Is it's not budget cuts. It's a realignment after, overly paying for and staffing beyond sustainable means, really. And so the adjustment is going to cause, in quotes, sort of right sizing to our actual numbers, since that's what we receive funding for. Clear as mud, I'm sure.
Thank you, Director Rankin. So the next thing that I wanted to ask about, were there changes to the WSS, to the weighted staffing standard formula this year? Did it change from last year?
Yeah, so there were not changes to the formula, but we did, because of the late breaking and the timing nature, the WSS committee did not put forward any changes that are formalized. We did make some decisions on some staffing, because one of the things that we had done with intention when we got our ESSER dollars is we had increased nurses and social workers out to schools. And so we wanted to maintain those investments. And so out of the new money that we're receiving for the prototypical model, we're able to continue to pay for those additional nurses and social workers. There's about another 25 positions or so that we're funding. So that change, you'll see in the WSS as a change, but it also says this is not a formal change yet, because the WSS committee has not approved it as yet or brought it forward as a sustaining, continuing recommendation.
Can you walk us through a little bit about how this kind of plays out in a building, or what this would look like? How does this work?
Yeah, so some of the things that we did. So staffing, enrollment, the enrollment planning office provides a projection to our office and budget, and that is based on head count. Those head counts are converted to AAFTE, annual average full-time equivalent, which is how we're actually funded by the state. And so what that takes into account is how much seat time a child has in gen ed. So typically the AAFTE is very close to 100% in elementary school, and then it kind of lowers as you go up in grades. So by the time you get to 12th grade, you may have a lot of part-time running start students or just part-time students, that kind of thing. And so you can slip down somewhere into the 80%. So your head count may be 100 kids, but your AAFTE may be 85 kids, right? So we fund based on AAFTE. That's the first thing that can be confusing because it's not intuitive. But we do that. Then we use the WSS, and Sam, I don't know if now is the right time for me to share my screen to kind of show what that looks like. We have it online. You can see it on our budget page now. But the WSS talks about how schools are allocated, and there's cut points. So sometimes the schools like on the tipping edge, and sometimes they tip over for the positive, sometimes they tip over for a reduction. So keep that in mind. So the WSS tells them how many teachers they're allocated, whether or not they're going to get an assistant principal, or how many in secondary they're going to get, how much of a nurse allocation they're receiving. The nurse allocation is a little trickier because it is also based on health needs of students attending that school. So there's a health need criteria and then a base model for nursing services in schools. And then the schools have some additional dollars that they decide what they want to buy up. Maybe they have Title I, maybe they have LAP dollars, maybe they have other grant dollars. So all of that comes together. The principal evaluates that, and they work with the building leadership team to decide how they're going to staff. And it's pretty simple. In elementary school, you're talking about how many teachers and whether you'll have splits or not based on how much staffing you received, how many interventionists you might hire. At secondary, it's really about how many course offerings and what your master schedule is going to look like.
And June, are you still there? Can you make JoLynn? Oh, you are. You are now a co-host. So if you wanted to share, you now have that ability. It's up to you if you want to or not.
So I'll just say that this is the WSS model. Like I said, it's online. I'm sure that Vivian can put the link in the chat for us because I know she's on top of this. But this talks about, every year we put this out. So every year it talks about what the major changes are, and then it just kind of goes over the facts, right? So it talks about what the per pupil non-staff supply dollars are. It talks about the equity tiering. We generally use equity tiering for mitigation, which we'll talk about in a moment. It talks about what the changes are. So you can see some of the things that we were able to increase. Middle schools now all have a 1.0 nurse. We did add some more counselors and social workers so that every school has at least a 0.5, which is a huge step for this school district, right? A huge step for our school district. And that's because of the legislative change. And then this talks about, making sure that we do use that to support student SEL. And then it just goes into the examples about how the weighted staffing standard is calculated and who gets how many staff for what purpose. This talks about who gets a principal, admin, secretary on down the line. There is a section for APs in here later on. There has been discussion with PASS about changing how APs are calculated, but there was an agreement that could be reached. PASS was still wanting to think about it some more. So this just kind of walks through the entire calculation. This is how special education is staffed. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing now, but that document is online, and please look at it.
So we get a lot of questions about how do the equity tiers interact with the WSS? Can you just talk a little bit about how those things interact with each other?
Yeah, the WSS was built before. So equity tiers is something new. The WSS has been in place for a long time. So equity tiering really helps us decide who gets, if we get more, like we had for a while, we were adding counselors and we added that by equity tier. So we added that base staffing out. If we have additional other staff, a lot of times we use equity tiering to decide who gets it first and in what order. We did mitigate some APs at tier 1 schools. So those schools dropped below where they would generate the AP based on enrollment. But because of their high needs population, we did decide to go ahead and, we look at equity tier. We do also look at special ed programming together when we look at mitigations. And they, 4 or 5 elementary schools did keep their AP. We have middle schools who weren't generating, comprehensive middle schools that are pretty small for a middle school, weren't generating a full-time AP, so we made sure that they were all getting one as well. And then we look at what else certain programs might need. Sometimes dual language, for example, Beacon Hill runs three languages, right, in their school. And they need to have a certain amount of teachers. So even though their enrollment is very small, it's 320 kids, I can tell you is not enough enrollment to generate the right amount of staffing for 3 languages. And so we come out and we have to mitigate some of those situations.
And we also get a lot of questions about how does the WSS interact with special education staffing? Like, how does that relationship work?
Okay. I'm going to share my screen again. And at the very back of this document, there are adjusted there. So special education and in the elementary setting, every student is a gen ed kid first, regardless of grade span. So in an elementary setting, all the students have a seat held in their homeroom or in their classroom, regardless of how much time they may spend in special education. At the secondary, it's a little bit different because you know that your children, and when they get into middle school and high school, they have first through however many periods. Let's say they have 6 periods a day. Our special education children receiving those services, depending on the program that they're in, spend a certain amount of time in a general ed classroom and a certain amount of time in their special ed classroom. So there is an adjustment for contact time in specialized programs that our district uses, and that's explained on this page. So the special education staffing or the types of students that we serve in a school does take those children out of the gen ed classroom. And so their staffing is reduced by these percentages.
So their gen ed staffing is reduced by those percentages, but there's special education staffing that is added.
That's right. So they're staff for the gen ed program, or they're staff for the gen ed time that they're in gen ed. And then they're staff for the special education program that they're in as well.
Okay. At the building level, how much flexibility does a principal have in determining staffing for their building?
They have some flexibility. So some things that we require is you need to meet the K-3 ratio because we don't get the revenue from the state for smaller class sizes unless we meet it. So right out of the gate, you need to meet the K-3 class size. Even though the collective bargaining agreement has a much higher class size, we fund much lower to get that additional revenue from the state. Ask the question again, Sam, because my mind isn't blank.
It was how much flexibility does a principal have in determining?
Okay. And so the principal has to meet the collective bargaining agreements. They can do waivers. So some waivers may say, well, I want to take my half-time registrar and make it an office assistant instead. Or I want to use my waive my counselor, or maybe some of them want to waive their AP and have a head teacher. So there's certain waivers that both the district has to agree to and either the Principals Association or SEA, Seattle Education Association, need to agree to as well. So that is flexibility for them. Generally, though, they have the support of their BLT or their building leadership team. So every principal does not build their budget in isolation. They have a team in their building that brings that budget forward that will bring those waivers forward.
And on that BLT, my understanding is that BLTs vary a bit building to building, that there is a fundamental core that has to be on a BLT at each building, but then there's a little bit of flexibility. Is that accurate?
There's supposed to be parent representation and there's supposed to be staff representation, generally speaking.
And there's a question chat that says the state just passed increases in staffing ratios for counselors. The WSS currently funds high school counselors at a ratio that's below what the state is funding. And that difference is only going to increase as the new state ratios come online. How do we explain this to families and school counselors? And it says counselors at our school feel that they're being shortchanged because they aren't funded at the state ratios. Is that?
Well, we do fund counselors across the district. We're buying as many counselors as the state funds when you add counselors and social workers together, right? When you add those two things together, whether they're spread to high schools in the same ratio, that may be where we made a different choice. But I will say where this district has chosen to buy up is really been in nurses. So that has been our big area of buy up, is we're way over our allocation in nurses, as you all know from when we talked about our levy. We're pretty right on point with counselors and social workers in totality.
I'm seeing a few more questions related to the WSS over here. So I'm just gonna call some of these out. One question here says, our principal says she needs extra funds to get to a special kind of schedule, but she can't remember the name of the schedule. But I guess it makes the school transitions more even or gives the teachers longer breaks. Is it true that other schools are not staffed to this level? And using PTA money to make the schedule better for some teachers at our school, but not all teachers in the district, feels inequitable.
That's possible, right? That is possible. I think one of the things that we often see, because there are class size differences between K-3 class sizes that are funded by the state and funded at the district versus a 4-5 class size, which are much larger. A lot of times people try to have no splits in their school, and sometimes that's doable, sometimes it's not, frankly, right? And so you have to make a choice. If you want, and if your PTA wants to buy up staffing, there is a limit on that. That's new in the last couple of years. Well, right before the pandemic, I want to say, because I remember being downstairs when that decision was made by the board. There's a $250,000 cap that you can exceed for additional staffing. So you can buy up to some degree, but not just anything you want. And there used to be anything you want.
Now, there's a question that says, regarding waivers, I understand art and music are priorities now at a district level. Is it true that funds for art and music could not be used to supplement a half-time librarian position, even if our elementary school asked for a waiver?
The waiver wouldn't come to us like that. So what you have to fund is you're given enough, schools are given enough funding to fill in for the prep period. So every teacher has a prep time, and there has to be specialists, and generally they're the PE, art, music, or librarian that does that in an elementary school, where they have to fill in during that teacher's prep period. And the school needs to decide which of those they're going to do. Sometimes it's a hard reach to do all of them to the extent that you want to. We generally do not see those kinds of waivers because it's not a staffing waiver per se. It's the building making a decision about offerings. So master schedule and what specialist teachers you're going to have. I mean, you have to have PE so many minutes. Some of the schools are the art pathways, and they've committed to doing certain things with the art. But after that, there's not a requirement per se.
The next question I'm seeing is, does anyone in central office review the racial equity analysis budget reviews by the BLTs?
No, not at this time. I did not realize they were doing those. I think it helps them because, and now I may say some unpopular things, but if we want student-focused outcomes and we're really about equity, our decisions about staffing can't be about adults. They have to be about what our kids need. And so it can't be about power dynamics in the building, about who's been there a long time, about who people like. It needs to be about what your children need to succeed, to learn and grow and graduate.
And there's a response saying yes and thank you. And there's a follow-up to the question about counselors was, would it be possible for the district to communicate to counselors why their ratios don't look like the prototypical ratios, like how that decision is? Because I guess at this building there might be concern. So
yeah, we have, I don't think it makes anybody happier, but we can't choose to do, when we've chosen to go beyond state funding in so many areas, special education, EL, principals, nurses, there's some offsets to that, right? You can only make so many choices in that direction, and then you're going to have to sit where it doesn't feel like there's enough. And that's, I think, what we're feeling in the counselor area is that we're getting these additional units from the state. Why are we not giving more? But what we have to remember is that in Seattle, we still have a structural budget deficit, and the state is basically finally paying for things we've already been paying for that we couldn't afford to continue to some degree, right?
and I see that Director Rankin has noted in the chat that it is important note is that BLTs are a function of the contract between SEA, that's Seattle Education Association, and Seattle Public Schools. It is in the CBA, which is the contract bargaining agreement, not the district or board policy. So we have another question here that we're planning for tonight, which is we've started to hear a bit about how we're in a bargaining year. Our district and the teachers union, which is Seattle Education Association, they negotiate a labor agreement. And sometimes our parents aren't really aware of the CBA, but there's a lot of stuff in the CBA that has an impact on our students. Can you talk a little bit about how the CBA constrains the WSS or works with the WSS so we can have a sense of what that means?
Yeah. So the CBA binds the district, and in some ways it represents our commitments, and so that's okay. But there needs to be a balance between how there has to be some flexibility in the system to make it work as we change over time. And so all of the caseloads that we have are in the collective bargaining agreement. Some of the program constructs are in the bargaining agreement as well. For special ed and EL, what those programs need to look like. So I will say this, as we continue, so right now our program structure in special education is not really aligned to what the state or best practice recommend. So how do we make some adjustments to make some realignment so maybe we don't have, so that we can continue to evolve? Because staying in the same place with the same things the same way may work over 20 years, or it may need to make some changes, because we need to make sure that we have least restrictive environment for our students, that they're served in gen ed to the amount that we can, and that we have a special education program that supports all the special education students in that building, and that we have supports for those students when they go to the gen ed classroom as well. And so we need to continue to evolve our practices in that area. And it's more difficult when it's in the CBA, right? Then we go to the table and we have to talk about it, that sort of thing. There's other things like caseload, overages. There's a lot of other components to the CBA about what a teacher can or can't do, or who can do what kind of work. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, you know, it can be complicated.
And I see a question in the chat. Is it common to have program structures in CBAs just more broadly, I guess, in other districts? Is this?
No, we have more than everyone else. We have more specificity, let me say that, in our collective bargaining agreement. So generally in most districts, it's not real specific about naming like resource access, medical fragile. They just talk about special education staffing. Maybe they have 1 or 2 special programs, but we are very specialized in Seattle, and that is different than other districts.
So I know that you have been following what has been happening in the legislature very, very closely. Does the WSS for 22-23 take into account what has gone on in the legislature this session?
It does. We made some very good educated guesses about what enrollment stabilization might look like for us. So as we were making a plan and working with our board on that plan, we thought we might get about $28 million of enrollment stabilization. We got 30 million, pretty close. Additional staffing, we thought we were going to get more staff. We made that commitment and pushed that out at the end of February before we knew for sure. But again, all of that's covered by the legislature. And so we're able to do some increases, not as much as any of us want, right? But we are doing staffing increases. And I know the district is very committed as we get some of those ratios increase over the course of the next couple of years, right? They're in a 3-year phase in. So how we can continue to increase those each year is the next piece of our work.
And I'm seeing another question in the chat around 1664, the changes to the prototypical model. And it says, still trying to understand what the passing of the bill about school staffing increases means for my school. I see it increases minimum allocations for a few positions, including a 0.132 allocation for social workers in elementary schools. Should my school be seeing this reflected in our budget? And if not, are we going to benefit from the passing of this bill in the future?
It depends on what your school got. We don't fund in 0.132, right? So one of the things is that you have to take the allocations, which are a little goofy from the state, a 0.132, a 0.06. None of those are really, we fund in much more round numbers. So if you already had a half-time counselor or social worker in your school, likely not going to see another adjustment. If you were one of the schools who had nothing, then everyone has now at least a 0.5 counselor slash social worker in their school. So it depends on where you were. If we'd already front funded you with the district, then not next year, there's no increase. But if you were one of the schools that didn't have anything, you're getting a 0.5.
And so I do want to reiterate again that when we're looking at something like 1664 and their charts, they're talking about the prototypical formula, which is how the money comes from the state to the district, but it's not about how the money goes from the district to the building. From the district to the building is the WSS, right, in our district. Mm-hmm. But each district in the state does it differently. So it's not that we're unusual in having and not doing exactly what the prototypical formula states, right?
That's very true. And I see the question about the nurse in the chat. Let me say this, most districts don't have certificated nurses in most of their buildings. They use a classified nurse or they use a healthcare tech or a worker. So that's one choice that we have mostly certificated nurses in our buildings. But that's a way different cost than some of those other things. Maybe there's room to look at a mix based on health needs. I'm not sure about that, but no, we have to make choices. And so a 0.2 nurse for under 300 students. So we are at the ratio that's in the CBA. We are at the ratio that they had asked for. I think we're over that now at 1 to 1,000 for nursing staff. But a 0.2 FTE for a nurse that's under 300. That's one of the things that's hard. When you have a small school that's under 300, you just don't generate a whole lot of additional support staff to make it.
So I want to reiterate, I know we keep talking about it. Enrollment is down. It's down unevenly. Some buildings have had more losses, some have had less, right, as far as enrollment. And sometimes there's a bit of space between how things might look on paper or in a formula and how things work out in a building. Is there any sort of appeals process for like a principal to go through or something like that after they get their staffing ratios?
Yeah, so there are if they truly have an appeal. So one, everyone has a good reason to need more staff. That's a given. The way that we have things structured in our district, we have a lot of small schools, and so they just don't generate very much nurse allocation, and it's a 0.5 counselor / social worker and not an AP. If a school can ask for mitigation if they truly have an exception. So one of the things that principals have to do as school leaders is be able to have that conversation with their families and their staff to have an honest conversation about, we're not different than anyone else. It's not something that we really need to be asking for an exception about. Principals are pretty well versed in what those situations are where they should come and ask for an exception and a mitigation. They work through that with their director of schools. One of the things is the principals all received all the reductions for all of the schools, because without that, you have no context of how much you're impacted versus another school. So many of our schools, we have 90 schools that have staffing reductions. Some of them have 1 position, one of them has 8. So a lot of schools are within that continuum.
I meant to ask this earlier, but you've told us a lot about the WSS, and there's a work group that updates the WSS formula. Who participates in that work group?
So we have SEA represented, and there's a lot of our principals at every grade level represented. So we have elementary, KA, middle school, and high school. And then there's central office folks on that committee as well. And really, we're talking about how do you allocate, what's the recommendation? The WSS is the committee that makes recommendations to the superintendent. The superintendent has the final decision about what to bring forward to the board. But typically, those recommendations are moved forward, and that's how that, so they can change AP. Let me say this, AP allocations were changed a few years ago. It used to be based on enrollment and the types of students served. Principals asked us to change it to how many teachers you had to evaluate. And I think now the thought is that teacher evaluation is not new any longer, and it's not taking as much time maybe as we thought it was going to. And so we're looking, and there's some conversation about principals wanting to change it back to what kind of students that you're serving to generate an AP versus how many staff you have.
And is there space in this process for parent advocacy or testimony, or do parents have a voice, or do they fit into this process anywhere?
Yeah, right now the WSS is an internal process. However, the outward facing component is really the participatory budgeting group. So the participatory budgeting group kind of talks about budget externally, and that's our space and place for engagement. And I know Seattle Council has been on that.
And I've seen in the chat a couple of questions around PTA funding and PTA money, and are there restrictions or what? How does that work as far as that goes?
Right. So a school generating from all of their PTA types of grants can add an additional $249,999 in staffing, but they can't go above that. The board has already been rejecting approving anything past that. And they're looking to change policy 6114, where that would be more formally stated.
There's a question in the chat that says, what do you say to principals who communicate to their school communities that they have these deep needs to serve children that are not being met by current funding? are they wrong, or is there language you can offer that counters that? What do you say to?
I think that there are some things that we can do in Seattle to make changes, but they're going to be hard choices. They're hard choices to make. And it's what are we willing to give up to get our student outcomes? I think that's where the board is very laser focused about what gets us to better student focused outcomes. And so I think that when you have a strong principal leader, they can communicate, this is where we're at, just like our district, right? I have to communicate, this is where we're at, this is how much we have. It's not what we want, it's not what we think we need, but it's what we've got. And we're going to do our very best. And we're going to get results that outpace other districts for our kids. And so I think that when you have a strong leader, they approach it from that mindset about, yep, there's some things that we could definitely need, and we're hopeful that we can get some additional staffing or resource in the future. But here's how we're going to move this forward in a way that supports our kids in our school.
And so we've talked about aligning our staffing and things like that. Do all buildings go through the same process to determine who stays and who is displaced? Is that the same from building to building?
Well, each building is going to decide. So I'll give an example more at the high school level. A high school may decide, maybe I have a really small 9th grade class coming in, so I don't need to offer X 9th grade class or as many sections. And so I don't need X number of teachers for, let's say, 9th grade English language. And so I don't need that teacher based on how I'm going to set up my master's schedule. And that happens, right? Every school will decide we're going to have a master's schedule. Oh, it means, Mr. Smith doesn't have anything to teach for half the day. So, we're going to displace him. So once a school decides how much staffing they need and which staffing they don't need any longer, or that they're choosing not to keep, or whatever the situation might be because they have lower enrollment, whatever, then it goes to the CBA, and the collective bargaining agreement outlines exactly the process for a displacement. I will say this, we have high turnover, we don't have high turnover. We have normal turnover in a district, but we have a big district. So we turn over 400 or 500 teacher positions every year. And so almost everyone, unless you have a very specialized endorsement and maybe you only want to teach a very specific class, they will get placed, just maybe not in their same school.
So one of the things that I'm feeling from families and from teachers and from the district is we don't have enough funding. We're not amply funded as a district. And we've talked about structural deficits, and we've talked about, we had a really successful short session, and we made progress on the prototypical formula, but this wasn't a budget year too. So we didn't have these big overarching conversations around overall funding. And before I go on, I do want to reiterate, you can inform, you cannot direct advocacy. You also, some of the information that you have is that you worked at OSPI, you've seen statewide. Can you tell us, first of all, do you have a sense of when the bills that dropped right before the session started, when were those bills drafted? When did that work start?
In the summer. So it starts in the summer. You have to have your legislative plan built out. So like the transportation bill we were working on last summer, and then you work on who your sponsor is going to be. So who are you going to get legislatively to sponsor the bill and be the prime, right? The person who has their name first on the bill is the prime sponsor. And who else are you going to try to get to endorse that bill? Are you going to only run it in the Senate? Are you going to try to have a companion in the House? So you have to have strategy around that. How controversial is the issue? Does SPI support it? All of those things factor into how you go about it. But typically bill drafting starts in the summer.
So next session is the long session, the budget session. We want ample funding. Can I ask you what conversations our district is planning to have with legislators during the interim? And for those who don't know, the interim is what we call this time between sessions when all of the bill drafting starts to happen. So what kinds of conversations are you planning to, is our district planning to have? And do you have any sense of what conversations legislators are really wanting to discuss, or things that they're asking you about?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to overcome is that the legislature would like to be done with K-12. In general, they want to not have us go away and be quiet. And that's not going to happen. And thankfully, we have a great Seattle Council PTSA, and we have super active parents that can keep our issues front and center. So those issues are going to include the transportation bill and how it's actually going to be funded. So you know that they passed a transportation bill that said we're going to pay for the full cost of special ed transportation, foster students, and students experiencing homelessness. And so we have to submit data all next year, and then the battle will be on as we submit that data to see how big they're going to put the funding bucket, right? We want it to, if they say we're going to fund it, we want it all funded. And so that's going to be important as that data comes in. So for Seattle, that's going to be a big, scary number, but it's the right thing to do, because we're having to put so many of our dollars, $20+ million out of levy to pay for transportation that we're not funded for, right? That's some of the reasons that we don't have enough, that we can't fund everything else that we want to do. We have those funding gaps. And transportation is not a place that we can make a choice. We need to do it. We have to do it. And it's costing us just straight more than the state's funding. So if we can get money for that, number one. Special education, number two. They have got to get back to fully funding special education. Now the transportation funding, fully funding of special ed transportation in the transportation bucket will help, but there's other components to special education that need to be caught up. I think the other thing is continuing at the prototypical model. We had COVID did help us. I will just say this, there is a silver lining for everything. That silver lining for us was movement in the prototypical model for nurses, counselors, social workers, and psychologists for us and for every district in the state. That would have not happened without COVID, I don't believe. So we need to continue to emphasize that they need to make progress, and they need to continue to fund, fully fund those things in the prototypical model. And I would also say this, while the legislature fully funded, or pretty closely fully funded, teacher salaries, we still only get an allocation that's worth about 50% of our classified salaries that we pay and our administrative salaries that we pay. Those two components of salaries have never been addressed. And there is a compensation study work group that we'll all want to keep our eye on about what comes out of that group. So it will deal with regionalization. It will deal with how we continue to increase, and are we keeping pace with teacher salaries? But it also needs to address those other two areas. So we're funded for three things: CLS, CAS, CIS. CLS, classified; CAS, classified administrative staffing; CIS, certificated instructional staffing. They have done work on CIS. They need to address the other two components in the apportionment formula. Sorry, I know that's really techie.
Techie is good. That makes us stronger advocates, because when we can use some of the techie language and understand it, our legislators listen to us more. And when we attach our personal stories, this is the technical language, but this is how it impacts my family. This is how it impacts our kids. I'm just making sure everybody knows that is the magic combination. Really understanding what's happening, and then being able to explain what the impact is on our kids. That's how we move our legislators. And I saw, I think it was Sarah mentioned in the chat, that if legislators want us to go away, they could amply fund education, and then we would go away. That there is a very simple solution to that problem. Unfortunately, I think what they want is to have us go away without that.
There is, and I do. I want to center us on Seattle does have more resources as a district than every other district. And so we do have that benefit and that privilege where we do get additional levy dollars. And we have the votes to get a higher amount, right? We saw that when our levy passed at 80%, we could have gone to a higher number than $3,000 per student. But the legislature is concerned about equity. They're concerned about slipping back into old ways. But they're going to have to find a mechanism to keep up, because it's either we're so constricted now, there's nowhere for us to go to get additional revenue. There used to be levy, and that's no longer an avenue for us. And so that's really a different construct than most other states.
And I'm seeing a question in the chat. Does free lunch stick around? Will that be?
It does not. That's a federal program. I wish it stuck around because it's the only time our food service program actually broke even. Again, something that's underfunded. I think a federal program that continued that would be incredible. And I think that that's something that I know we'll be reaching out to Senator Jayapal's office, Senator Murray's office. If there is a program that has direct impact to kids, it's that feeding every kid and not making it be about can you pay or can't you pay, all the stigmatism around that, taking that off the table and just feeding kids is the right thing to do. And we've had great success.
We had gotten a question, and I don't actually know the avenue for advocating on this, that Washington is one of the states that has not applied for the EBT going beyond. So 38 states have applied, and this is something that would provide money for families for food over the summer. It's the pandemic EBT. And I think that there were some thinking that our schools were in person and open, and therefore we wouldn't need pandemic EBT. But the way the federal law is written, it looks like over the summer, our families would be, if Washington State applied for this, that would be something that our families could benefit from. But I haven't been able to figure out who's in charge of that application. Do you know? And I know this is coming out of left field, but do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could probably ask OSPI. I think we could also ask Maddie Thompson, who is the governor's education policy person. She was just here tonight. So state EBT may be a function of DSHS.
Mm-hmm.
In conjunction with OSPI. So we'd need to figure that out.
Okay, thank you. And I know that came out of nowhere, but when lunch came up, I wanted to mention that because that's been something that I've been trying to figure out. A question in the chat: are the current levels of inflation going to negatively impact future Seattle Public Schools budgets?
It's going to, it depends. I mean, it depends. We rarely have kept up with inflation ever. Let me just say that. That's rare for us to ever keep up with inflation at the same pace. So I don't know that there's going to be immediate impacts to us. Whenever let me just say this is something that some of you may know. When the state provides a COLA or a cost of living increase, which for us, the factor is the implicit price deflator, or IPD. That's the factor that they're using to provide the COLA for the cost of living increase. Sometimes it can be the consumer price index, which inflates levy. Implicit price deflator is the cost of living index that they increase salaries for. When we get that money, it costs us more money out of our levy, because of what we just talked about. We pay higher salaries than the state provides. So we pay higher salaries than the state provides for many of our positions, and we have more positions than the state funds. So when we have an increase in our cost of living, it actually is a net cost to our district, which is okay, but just something that we have to keep in mind.
And then I see a question here. Putting aside levy funding, my understanding is that Seattle is underfunded relative to its size and cost of doing business and living here, so that we do have more resources available to. So do we have more resources available to us, or do we simply have more avenues for funding, like levy funding, out of necessity? Honestly curious, as I've heard different takes on this question.
I think that the regionalization factor didn't quite go far enough for us, right? But I do think that the levy dollars made it up, the additional $500 per student that we get. We also do have a city levy that no one else has in our state. So I think we come out ahead. In my mind, based on the data that I've seen, I still think that Seattle has more dollars, even given cost of living and that sort of thing, than other districts do.
And then there was mention in the chat, and I think this is good context for everyone, just that K-12 education funding is about 50% of the state budget. So that's one of the reasons
they're losing ground, Sam. They're losing ground. We're down to like 48%. We need to stay at 50.
So we do get a lot of the state budget. There was also the point made that it's because they underfund a lot of things, not just underfunding education. But
I was just going to say, if they would spend more money overall, our part wouldn't be so much of a piece.
Right. So we can say that that's their choice, right? And then there was a follow-up on the question from the chat saying, could you clarify what you were saying about levy not being an option in the future?
So before we could there was no cap per pupil. Now there's a cap per pupil that sits on what we can ask our voters to approve. Before there wasn't a cap per pupil, we could ask for whatever we felt like we needed. And our levy, because our tax base grew, we could continue, just like in our BEX and BTA levy, we could continue to ask for the same rate per 1,000, but generate a lot more dollars to our district. And now we cannot do that. So we're capped at the $3,000 per pupil. So in fact, our taxpayers continue to see lower and lower rates, which is good. I mean, that's great, but that's how that works in inverse. Hopefully that helps.
And then there's a comment in the chat, and I'm noticing the time too. It's 8:20, so we're going to need to wrap in just a moment. But it says, I'm concerned about the inequity from one school to add approximately a couple of teachers or other staff through PTA staffing, even with the WSS committee work. We need better funding levels in the state, yet what else can be done within the district to address equity for all of our students? Are there other things the district would get behind to address equity? What about a requirement that if one PTA is going to fund a teacher position for their school, they need to fund an equivalent teacher or staff position that the district can use to help a school that can't fund staffing from PTA funds?
Yeah, John, great question. And that has been thought of. So participatory budget brought that forward as a recommendation to the school board. That's why we need to work on policy 6114. The recommendation from participatory budget was that there be a tax. So if you give 100, let's say you want to give $100 to your school, 75 would go to your school, $25 would go to this other bucket. And then participatory budget in our community would be able to decide. They'd have schools that don't have PTAs or schools that really can't raise money as PTAs, be able to apply for those dollars. So a different way to spread the wealth in that type of a concept. So that's the concept on the table as the recommendation from participatory budget folks to our school board.
And there is a note in the chat, and this is accurate, that and I will emphasize that Washington State PTA strongly discourages PTAs from funding staff positions. So it is Washington State PTA does say that this is not something that they want our schools to do, our PTAs to do. So I want to bring us back and wrap us up a little bit. We know that we want ample funding. We know that we made some progress this session, but we are not at ample funding. And we know that we have a legislative session next year, and that conversations are going to be happening over the interim. So what I am really hearing that you can't say is we have some work to do. We have some work to do to talk to our legislators while session isn't happening, to find people who want to sponsor legislation, who really want to talk about, can we staff up the prototypical funding model? What does this look like? How can we work through this? And then I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat about ESSER. So why don't we kind of end on this last question about ESSER or potential federal funding? I see that President Biden in his State of the Union speech asked us to ask this question: is there additional ESSER potential funding still on the table or unallocated? So why don't we kind of have that as our last question? Is
Sure.
there more ESSER coming?
We have allocated all of ours out, meaning we have it all budgeted out, and we keep reallocating because our budget needs for COVID relief continue to grow. And we just spent way more in health and safety than we anticipated, and we've talked about that before. So we do not have any unallocated ESSER. I think there might be some left in the state, though, that we can access or that we may get access to. I think the county and the city and the state potentially have some untapped ESSER dollars, and we continue to try to ask about those. It was the same way when those 60,000 tests were sitting in a warehouse and they were going to expire in a couple months. And we finally got, we've been saying we don't have enough tests, we don't have enough tests. And they're like, okay, we'll give you these 60,000 tests. Now, should they have offered those to other districts? Probably, but we're the ones who've been pounding on the door saying we need more tests. We're the ones who committed our warehouse staff and their trucks to drive in a snowstorm down to get the 60,000 tests so that we could test our students on January 3rd or 4th or the first day back. And so that's kind of how that's working. We're continuing to advocate what we need to continue to do and protect our schools and our staff and our families and our students with state agencies. And I just know that there's some more money that might come our way. And we have plans to kind of have some backup plans as to how we can do that.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for spending this time with us. And I'm also going to thank you in advance because you're going to come back next month on April 19th. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the prototypical funding model and how that really works, and what does ample funding look like, and all of those really, really important things so that we can try and make some more progress and let our legislators know that we're not going away until they solve this problem. And as Sarah said, if they just solve the problem and amply fund our schools, we'll go away. And I see Director Rankin is saying that there is a board budget session next Wednesday. And so there's a lot more work to be done. And I will be emailing our PTAs in the near future. I've been taking a little bit of a pause after session, but I will be emailing all of you about the importance of asking legislators to come talk to us again and tell us about their legislative session and get in touch about how to keep in touch and how to continue to work together as we shift from the rush and drama and how many people can we get to sign in of legislative session to the long conversations and the deep conversations and this is the longer story about why we need this. So I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate everyone who came tonight. And so stay tuned, everyone. And then one final plug, keep an eye on your emails, folks. Seattle Council PTSA is partnering with National PTA around updating the National Family Engagement Standards, and we are hosting listening sessions. This Saturday, we have a listening session specifically for disabled parents and disabled caregivers to let National PTA know what family engagement needs you have. We also have one that will be in Spanish for Spanish-speaking families. We will also be having ones coming up for teachers, one for teachers and one for families, just general education families. But if you are a disabled parent or caregiver and you have not gotten that invitation, email me and I will get it to you because it's really important that we hear from our disabled parents and our disabled caregivers. So thank you, everybody. And we will see you next time.
Thank you. Great job, Sam.
Thanks, JoLynn. Thanks for all of this.